In medieval Europe, the executioner was an essential figure in maintaining law and order, but simultaneously marked as an outcast. Despite being an official figure sanctioned by the state, their work was surrounded by a deeply rooted paradox. While the executioner's role was legal and integral to upholding justice, society's view of them was often one of disgust and spiritual contamination. Executioners were seen as necessary to enforce the law, but were simultaneously viewed as morally unclean, their work leaving a permanent stain on their spiritual purity. The role of the executioner in medieval society was paradoxical. On one hand, they were entrusted with carrying out the laws of the land, delivering justice in the form of execution. But on the other hand, they were excluded from the community. The very act of execution, even though done in service of the law, was seen as a violation of Christian moral principles. For those living in medieval Europe, death was not merely the end of life, but a passage into the afterlife. To be involved in executing others, particularly through violent means, was considered an act that spiritually defiled the executioner. This deep division was most evident in the way the executioner was treated by the church. The church held immense power in medieval Europe, and the concept of spiritual purity was central to social and religious life. Executioners were often barred from entering churches, participating in mass, and were denied the sacraments, even though they were fulfilling an official, state-sanctioned role. Their spiritual impurity made them unfit for the communal worship that was considered essential for salvation. Executioners were seen as people whose very presence in sacred spaces could profanate the holiness of the church. This exclusion from religious life went beyond mere social isolation. It was a spiritual alienation that left executioners in a perpetual state of guilt and shame. Priests in many cities refused to hear the confessions of executioners, believing their sins could never be cleansed. In some cases, the church allowed executioners to confess, but only from a distance, either behind a screen or outside the church walls. The mere presence of an executioner in a religious setting was believed to pollute the sanctity of the space. This spiritual rejection, coupled with their role as enforcers of capital punishment, marked executioners as outsiders in both the physical and spiritual worlds. The exclusion of executioners from the church was a form of social stigmatization. Theologians in the medieval period often debated whether executioners could serve divine justice. Some argued that by carrying out state punishment, the executioner was performing a necessary service in upholding the moral order of society. Others, however, believed that their very involvement in death, particularly violent death, tainted them spiritually. The question of whether a man who dealt in death could truly serve divine will created a tension that was felt in every aspect of the executioner's life. This alienation wasn't limited to the spiritual realm. Socially, executioners were also marginalized. In many cities, executioners were legally or unofficially required to live outside the city walls. They were often given houses on the outskirts, isolated from the rest of the population. This segregation wasn't due to any physical danger the executioner posed, but because their mere presence was believed to bring moral and spiritual contamination to the community. The physical exclusion of the executioner reflected the social exclusion they experienced, and living outside the city reinforced their status as outsiders. In some cities, neighborhoods known as these homes were located far from markets, churches, and public spaces, underscoring the idea that, while the executioner served an official role, they should not be seen or integrated into the life of the city. The message was clear: justice must be done, but it should not be visible or welcome. This physical isolation of the executioner reinforced their status as pariahs, and ensured that their daily life was spent outside of normal society. Furthermore, this separation wasn't just a matter of location but of existence. Executioners lived in a perpetual state of otherness. They were required to stay far from the rest of society, cut off from the rituals and customs that bound communities together. This forced isolation also had a significant impact on their families. The children of executioners were marked by the same social stigma as their parents. Even though the children were innocent, they were often excluded from normal life. They were denied entrance into guilds, barred from apprenticeships, and even forbidden from marrying into respectable families. The children of executioners inherited the same social disgrace that was imposed on their parents. In some cases, the role of executioner was passed down through generations, not out of choice but because few other occupations were available. The professional legacy of the executioner was one of social rejection of fate that continued across family lines, creating a cycle of executioners were not just socially isolated, they were physically separated from the rest of society in almost every way. Public spaces like the market were particularly often. In cities like Augsburg and Basilea, executioners were prohibited from even touching goods in the markets. The superstition surrounding their work was so strong that even simple actions, like picking out bread or fruit, were seen as spiritually polluting. In some cases, vendors would only sell to executioners if they used poles or gloves to avoid direct contact. This was not just superstition, it was a reflection of how deeply embedded the stigma of the executioner was in medieval society. The isolation of the medieval executioner extended far beyond the walls of the city. Their role in society, while essential for the upholding of justice, made them marked figures, both socially and spiritually. In fact, Living as a medieval executioner was like existing behind a wall of seclusion and humiliation, where even the simplest interactions in daily life were marked by rejection and distaste. One of the most significant forms of alienation was their physical separation from the rest of society. In many medieval cities, laws or social customs dictated that executioners must live outside the city walls. Their homes were often built in isolated neighborhoods, far from churches, markets, and other public spaces. These homes, sometimes called Henkerhäuser or executioners' houses, were designed to physically isolate the executioner from the rest of the population. The belief was that the mere presence of an executioner in the city could bring moral and spiritual contamination, as their role was tied to death and punishment. Even though executioners were performing an official role sanctioned by the state, their work was viewed with suspicion and fear. It was not just their profession that set them apart, but their connection to death. This social exclusion was a constant reminder that, despite their essential role in the justice system, executioners were seen as outsiders who did not belong in the civic or religious spheres. Their isolation was not just physical, but also deeply psychological. They were denied the basic human connection that comes from being part of a community. This physical separation reinforced their status as pariahs in society. Executioners were shunned by their neighbors, forced to live on the outskirts, in a state of alienation from everyone else. In many towns, this social segregation was enforced by law. Their existence in the public eye was to be minimized. Their homes were located in areas far away from public life. They often lived near execution sites or gallows hills, places that were physically and symbolically separate from the rest of the town. This geographical distance ensured that the executioner was physically distant from community events and social connections. The forced isolation was also a way of ensuring that the executioner's family would inherit the same stigma. Children of executioners, regardless of their innocence, were often raised in exile and were socially ostracized from the rest of society. They had limited opportunities, facing rejection in the same way their parents had. Many of the executioner's children could not join guilds, could not hold respectable positions, and were often excluded from the chance to marry into decent families. This continued cycle of social exclusion meant that the stigma of the profession was passed down, creating generations of in a society where birth and social status were crucial. The role of the executioner placed them and their families in a perpetual state of marginalization. As the executioner performed his duties, carrying out the law of the land, he was rejected by society. Because his duties were connected to death and punishment, things that were viewed as impure and corrupt. Even though his job was officially sanctioned, the executioner's connection to death tainted his entire identity, making him a permanent outsider. This alienation extended beyond physical isolation and affected daily life in even the simplest of ways. One of the most striking aspects of this social stigma was the restriction on touching goods in markets. In many medieval cities, executioners were prohibited from touching items in public markets with their bare hands. Even the act of selecting bread or fruit was viewed as an act that polluted the goods. In places like Augsburg and Basilia, local ordinances forbade executioners from handling merchandise directly. They were often required to use a stick or glove to point to the item they wished to purchase. This was done to prevent a spiritual contamination that was believed to come from touching anything with the hands of someone who had been in contact with death. Such restrictions weren't based purely on superstition. They were rooted in a deep belief in the impurity of the executioner's touch. Many townspeople believed that just being near the executioner, or even having an item touched by his hands, could defile the goods and anyone else who came in contact with them. This extreme belief led to discrimination in daily life, where everyday activities became a source of humiliation for the executioner. Burial practices and social exclusion after death. Even in death, the executioner could not escape the rejection of society. In medieval Europe, burial was an important ritual, not just for the body but for the soul's passage into the afterlife. However, for the executioner, even in death, exclusion persisted. Burial in consecrated ground was a privilege denied to executioners, as they were considered ritually impure due to their repeated association with death. The law of the church explicitly stated that those who shed blood, even in service to the law, were spiritually defiled. As a result, executioners were often buried in unconsecrated ground, such as crossroads or gallows hills, places seen as unholy and outside the boundaries of sanctity. This final indignity was not only an insult but a spiritual condemnation. In a society where eternal salvation depended on a proper burial and church rites, being denied this final blessing was the ultimate mark of rejection. The executioner's soul was thought to be forever lost, beyond the reach of grace and divine mercy. The burial of the executioner in places far from the church or community symbolized the final rejection of the man. Even after death,